I'm going to pause the recording.
Thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Denis Pennel. I'm the Managing Director of the World Employment Confederation, and I'm very happy to welcome you for this this new episode of our WEConversations, the series of webinars that we are organizing on some specific topic. And today, as you might have seen on the agenda, this is back from Geneva and the International Labour Conference organized by the International Labour Organization. It took place over the last 2 weeks, and from the World Employment Confederation, we are very happy to have a large and very engaged, delegation from our own members, as well as from the head office staff, contributing to the discussion. For those that might not be fully aware of what are we talking about, the ILC is actually the one time in the year during which kind of a global parliament is convening with representatives from the three constituents of the ILO: governments, workers, and employers, and they are debating, discussing, and hopefully, if successful, adopting some joint documents or recommendations. Quite impressive altogether. This is about 5,000 people coming all together from 180 different countries, governments. The delegation of employers, all employers together, is about 500 people, so quite also a large one. And yeah, very important moment during the year that indeed decisions and documents are being adopted within the framework of the United Nations International Labour Organization. Just to provide you a bit of content, this is what Gilbert Ongbo, the ILO DG, mentioned in his opening speech. The comment he made about this, changing world of work is even more challenging. He mentioned a challenging landscape. He clearly warned about the multiple crises that could jeopardize recent advances in the world of work. Clearly, we are today facing a very low level of unemployment around the world, which is really good, about 4.9%, so really good. But at the same time, he also mentioned the fact that we see more and more, wars and conflicts, raging from, Gaza, Yemen, Haiti, Sudan, Ukraine. So very, complex and difficult environments there. So that's probably something we might get back to, this changing world of work. Also interesting, I think it's, and then I would be very happy to hear from Tina. The political game also, between countries, the geopolitical dimension also more and more in the work of the ILO, with what is called the global south also emerging and becoming more vocal. So probably something we will get back to. But from the World Employment Confederation point of view, we followed two main discussions that took place during those 2 weeks. The first one is about fundamental principles and rights at work, and the other one was about decent work in the care economy. There was a main third topic for discussion, which was about biological hazards. And on that one, very happy to have Tina, who can also make some report on the progress being achieved over there. And of course, on top of that, the last week of the conference, also the inaugural forum on social justice was organized, also with high-level representatives from governments, employers, and workers. Actually, the president of Brazil was there and made a very passionate speech to the audience, so quite interesting. So this is just setting the scene. To be clear about this webinar, what are we trying to achieve or to provide you with? Well, first of all, indeed, this is an understanding of the main points that have been discussed during the ILC. What have been the achievements from the employer's perspective, and also a detailed assessment of the pluses and minuses, of these on the specific discussions there. So I would now welcome officially the speakers for today's conversation. First of all, Tina or Akustina Morni from the IOE. Tina is the Director for Employment, Skills and Diversity at the International Organization of Employers. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Tina, today. And of course, as you know, the World Employment Confederation has a specific relationship with the ILO. We are now a partner organization of this global association representing the employer side. So very happy to see this very close cooperation in action. And then we have invited two of our members who have been specifically following the two discussions that I mentioned earlier. First of all, Menno Bart from the Adecco Group, but also the chair of the Public Affairs Committee, who has been following the fundamental principles and rights at work, and Gustaaf van Oosterom from Randstad, who is also a member of our Public Affairs Committee. So thanks to the two of you for being with us today and being able to report on the different achievements on the respective conversation you have been following. And just before giving the floor to Tina, just already, trying to recognize the hard work that has been achieved over those 2 weeks. It has been very intensive weeks for everyone, but especially for those being actively engaged into those conversations. With some, negotiations ended at 2 a.m. or even 4 a.m. in the morning. So tough time. Not the best working conditions, but again, what is important is the achievements and the outcomes of the conference, and this is exactly what we are going to discuss right now. So I will first give the floor to Tina, who will provide you with an update or an overview, of the assessment from the employer's perspective. Then we will open the floor for a couple of questions to Tina, and then we will go more into the details of the two main discussions that we discussed, I presented earlier. So Tina, the floor is yours. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you, Denis, and greetings from Geneva. Hello, colleagues and friends. It is a pleasure for me to be here with all of you for this WEC conversation and to debrief you on the ILC outcomes. But before going to my remarks, I just want to say how much we appreciate the relationship we have with WEC. We have known each other for some years now. And it is a good, last year to officially institutionalize this relationship and cooperation. So I echo fully, Denis, all your remarks. We really do appreciate this cooperation and friendship. It is important for like-minded organizations to join forces, really, because together we can have a stronger voice when it comes to advocacy work, especially in the international scene through international diplomacy. So I will, if with your permission, Denis, I will do a presentation on the questions that was asked for me according to agenda. So the questions were, what are the most important topics that were discussed? What were the most controversial points or issues? And then there was a question here, what did we manage to secure as key achievements? And the last question was on the way forward and what can we expect next year at the ILC as the main topics. So with regards to the topics that was discussed, Denis already mentioned, WEC colleagues have been really active in two of the discussions. There are 7 committees in total, but for the substantive negotiations, there are 4 committees. So there is that, Denis mentioned the standard setting on biological hazards. This is the first discussion, meaning this is there will be another discussion next year to finalize that. And then there were also some country cases through the Committee on Application of Standards, what we call SCAS. And of course, we have the general discussion on the care economy. Gustaaf, of course, was there together with Andrew, Sonia, Bev was also there. And I was not alone for this particular committee. I'm also supported by my colleague Stephanie, who most of you know, Amadou, Annelise, and of course, Milo, Actam, Jahid. And we have the recurrent discussion, as mentioned by, Denis as well, which Menno has been following. And of course, Denis, you were there too, and Bettina, of course, with us. So it was really nice to see all of you there in person. So what were the most controversial points or issues? So I will let Menno and Gustaaf talk about the Fundamentals Committee and also the Care Economy Committee, as they were there in what we call in the trenches with us. I can complement, of course, if needed. And we are open to suggestions for improvement on the IOE side, either here or bilateral. We'll be happy to continuously improve. So with regards to the standard setting on biological hazards, so what does the standard setting mean? It means that constituents, the 3 constituents, the workers, employers, and workers and governments, we all need to decide on whether to have a convention or a recommendation, or a hybrid of both. What we saw from what we call a yellow report. So this is a report that will be used as a basis for the discussion last 2 weeks. We already received hints that there are a lot of governments and, of course, the workers, they're keen to have a convention to be supplemented by recommendations. So this is the hybrid that I mentioned. So a convention, as you know, is legally binding. So when countries ratify and it comes into force, it's legally binding. So that will have implications, of course, in terms of compliance, in terms of, reforming labor law, in terms of how policies are crafted at the national levels, how social dialogue plays out, what are the implications for companies in practical terms. So all that really comes under, when a convention is being decided. So in this case, the committee has decided, despite our strong objections from the employers group, the committee has decided to adopt draft conclusions, which proposes for convention to be supplemented by a recommendation. And a recommendation is more of a guidance, it's not legally binding, and governments can report on the progress. So, we were pushing for a recommendation. However, the committee has decided to adopt, the draft conclusions with this in mind. To be frank, this was a really difficult discussion for our group. There are a lot of elements that were contributed to the difficulty of these discussions. The lack of support from the other constituents, namely all the governments and the workers group, makes it really difficult to push through a lot of the proposals that we wanted. The working methods itself it kept changing, so it was unclear. So that was not helpful. And the large number of amendments that came in also took time, and that poses a challenge. There were 382 amendments, which was very rare. The recommendation for the apprenticeship one, it was only 290, but this one was 382, and the constituents only managed to go through 317 of those. So there was progress in the second week, but the first week, I would say, was really challenging. We were going against the tide. There was almost a vote, but it didn't take place. So in terms of substance, though, regardless of the working methods and all the other challenges, us being, alone in the room, there were a lot of there was a debate on the scope, because the scope was broad. It looked at biological hazards in the working environment, but it also looked at elements that's related to public health and emergency. So there's no clarity in terms of coverage and the scope. The second part that we were arguing about was there were strong references to risk assessment approach based on OSH existing practices, but it doesn't look at the other side of the coin, which is the sustainability of enterprises. It doesn't look at national circumstances. It doesn't look at how it's disrupting the labor market. So that part there, I would say, is not balanced. The employer responsibilities has been shifted to the recommendations. So the argument by the other constituents is that, well, for the employers, there are some working, they can only propose elements that should be included as a recommendation because their working conditions are under the control. However, the duties or the responsibilities of the workers, it's kept in the draft convention. So that was another argument. Another, I guess, I would see this as a positive. We managed to get some of the amendments of the workers group out. For example, they were pushing for, income protection during periods of isolation or in a situation where there's a quarantine, right? So we managed to remove that. We had strong arguments, and some governments were with us on that. So that did not go through. There were also some wins there in terms of, there's a strong push from the workers group to include due diligence. And obviously the EU directive is playing out in the background, the due diligence and human rights for multinationals and supply chain, which clearly is a sensitive topic for us. We managed to get that out. There are some references to the right to effective remedy for workers and the precautionary approach and principles, which is quite vague, was also out. There's mention of mental health However, but doesn't touch on psychosocial and other adverse effects. So that's another element that we wanted to look at. So, you know, with regards to this particular committee, it is not too late to have a balanced outcome next year, but we really need to be honest, and we need to really lobby hard, and we're counting on you colleagues to also lobby hard with your governments in preparation for next year's ILC if you are following this committee. Because we need a practical and balanced approach. I mean, on one side, we understand it's important to protect workers, but on the other side, we also need to look at how it's impacting enterprise sustainability, especially micro, small, medium enterprises who do not have the capacity to do so. So that then there must be a differentiated approach. How do we look at this risk-based approach that they're pushing for? How do we minimize, as I mentioned before, labor market disruptions? And how can we also take into account the different national circumstances? So I think between now and next year, there needs to be a lot of lobby work. And now they need going to the CAS, the country cases. This needs, I mean, we completed discussions in the general report, the general survey. There were some cases of serious failures. And there's a tripartite examination of 24 country cases and a special sitting on Belarus. The special sitting on Belarus was very controversial in the sense that we've never had a vote before on in the CAS context. So usually the employers and the workers group hold the pen. So we both, together with the workers, draft the conclusions, but Belarus did not accept this draft conclusion, and they called for a vote. And they lost the vote. However, this is something that we have not seen before. So the outcome of the sitting on Belarus is that the ILC will continue to hold future sessions and a special sitting on the CAS on Convention 87. So that's freedom of association, and Convention 98, that's collective bargaining, and seeing whether or not they comply and implement the Commission of Inquiry. So there are a lot of repercussions when countries are in the list. So I'll read now just quickly for your information, the 24 individual cases. And this is something that, Rita, Altia, and some, the ILO team are supporting, are focusing on that. So in the list this year was Uganda, Paraguay, Turkey, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Colombia, Philippines, Laos, PDR, Tunisia, Turkmenistan, Algeria, Australia, Netherlands, El Salvador, Peru, Spain, Eswatini, Gambia, Georgia, Guinea, Japan, Ecuador, Kazakhstan, and Mexico. So there are repercussions when there are individual cases, and these are based on tripartite negotiations. So I'll read now the repercussions from the least to the most serious, that what could happen as a result of the country case. So one, you could have a report whether the CAS recommendations have been implemented. So that's the least serious. And then it goes on to say that, okay, you need a roadmap or national action plan, which I believe is doable for most countries. And then it goes on to say, ILO technical assistance, so countries that need help to implement the CAS recommendations, there is the ILO capacity to provide technical assistance. And this is when it starts to get serious. There could be high-level tripartite mission to implement. So this could be from the ILO, it could be director from norm. So there is some more focus and attention on that. And then that's what they call an ILO direct context mission. So this is where a judge, a professor, etc., on top of the ILO staff, and that's tripartite, goes to the country to do this mission and do the report. And then it goes on to, you can refer the case to the governing body for future measure. So that's going to be under the microscope. And the last one, the most severe one, is when you get mention of the case in what they call a special paragraph of the CAS report. So this is when they say that the countries of serious failure. So those are...
to interrupt, but could you remind us how the cases are being identified and being put forward to the committee? Is that, is one constituent that could, case, or how does that work?
So I'll oversimplify it. Basically, it's the tripartite constituents that decide So before it gets into this, like in the short list, the 24 individual cases, each of the previous cases would need to go through a tripartite negotiation. So we have a spokesperson, the workers have a spokesperson, the governments as well. And then basically they all have, the country itself has to, I would say, defend itself on why it shouldn't be, you know, on the case. So they could say something like, okay, well, with Convention 98, that we do have some provisions, we made some changes in our labor law to allow freedom of association, so this should be considered in favor. And this is when I would say, Denis, behind the scenes, a lot of political work is behind, because everyone's lobbying IOE, everyone's lobbying ITOC, everyone's lobbying the government, everyone's lobbying each other, because they do not want to be in the short list, because once they're in the short list, then the, you know, it really gets, yeah, it's not legally binding, but the microscope is on the country itself, and it's on the website. So of course all the newspapers, they love it, right? So, you know, they will catch on to that. I'll say, oh, you know, this country has been a case at the ILO, and these are the government has been in contravention of, I don't know, Convention 169 or 144, and then it really gets in the spotlight. So they're trying to avoid that. And the workers and the employers group, once they get into the short list, we also have the possibility for some of our members to also support or not support. So based on that, this is when it's very interesting. The employers and the workers hold the pen. So we are the ones drafting the workers group, the draft conclusions. So we have more control in that sense. But this is when it's interesting, when we never saw a vote before, where Belarus did not accept the draft conclusions that was drafted by the employers and workers group, and they were calling for a vote. So that was an unusual, I would say, case that we haven't seen before.
Oh. Would you allow me a question, on more clarification question?
Yeah.
About the difference between a convention and a recommendation, because I know there is always discussion with what's best or what's worst, you know, depending on your point of view. Because indeed, the convention, country has to ratify the convention, and then of course it has to comply with all the key provisions, while a recommendation, as you say, is more guidelines, you know, on a specific topic. And some people are saying, yeah, convention are more, you know, stringent because you have to ratify and to comply. But if you don't ratify, actually, the convention has no impact at the national level. While a recommendation, you know, any government can get inspiration from a recommendation. Say, oh, I like this one. Do some picking and sharing. Say, I take this provision. So actually, some people are saying that a recommendation can even be more, you know, influential or have a stronger impact at the national level. What's your view on that?
Yeah, so we get these questions a lot, and as you rightly said, Denis, a convention is more legally binding, and a recommendation isn't. It's more of a guidance. So it depends how strongly constituents feel about that. For example, violence harassment is such a hot topic that optics-wise, they prefer a convention because it shows, you know, they're taking it seriously. You know, it's more. I would say, even if the country doesn't ratify, and even if it doesn't come into force, governments still look to it to, I would say, reform the labor law. So even if they don't ratify, they will still look to the ILO for guidance. And the ILO team, you know, the different technical teams, they always push for ratification. So in the end, they will ratify, especially when all the domestic legislation talls into place. So we're always pushing for recommendation, because as you saw, the apprenticeship one was a good one. It takes into account it gives flexibility. It takes into account the different, in the particular for the apprenticeship one, they take into account the different TVET systems, right? Each country is different. But typically for a hot topic like violence or harassment, biological hazards, they tend to want to have a convention, because then it pushes for the labor law to change. So, I mean, the workers always want a convention because it's a way to punish companies mainly. You know, so that's.
Because at the same time, we see governments, you know, and I'm not going to do any naming and shaming, but, you know, supporting the adoption of any convention, but they never ratify a convention, you know. So that's where you see the limit also of the power of a convention.
I mean, just look at the US.
I didn't want to mention the country.
Yeah, I mean, we've always said that. I don't know if you, I mean, during Matunzi's time, the spokesperson before Renate, he's always been saying, he's got a point. Like all these countries that actually make a lot of noise in the plenary at the ILC, they're the ones that actually don't ratify. So we always call them out, you know, in the various ILC negotiations. But in the end, you know, they always say that, oh yeah, you know, there some difficulties because it has to go to lower house, upper house, you know, all through, you know, different, you know, parliament, you know, there are a lot of difficulties. It's always the case. So we always say, well, are you going to ratify it? And there's so many conventions that are not being ratified, and it becomes outdated in the end. That's what we're always pushing for. And that's why we have what we call an ILO, it's tripartite supervisory review mechanism, the SRM, you might have heard it. So the job of this SRM, and you know, the workers, employers, and governments are there, is to look at what are the conventions that are outdated, which conventions has low ratification and needs to go out. And that's why you see every year there's what they call an abrogation of conventions, simply because, you know, the countries don't ratify. And that's something that we've been pushing for, because, you know, we've been saying it in a very diplomatic manner. Why is the ILO a factory of labor standards when countries don't even bother ratifying after 2 weeks of negotiations at the ILO? So, you know, that's what we've been saying. But the ILO also has, I would say, an interest to produce, you know, conventions, because I imagine it's also to show relevance within the UN family, because the UN family has their own, I would say they're also competitive among themselves. So the ILO also needs to prove its relevance when it comes and show that, okay, we're the house that is in charge of labor and social issues. So these normative, I would say, role is important to them. So that's why I believe the ILO-DG and the whole team are always pushing for, you know, standards to come out every year. And that's why we're now in a situation next year where we incredibly have 2 standard settings. So, you know, one on the biological hazards, which is the second year, and the one on the platform economy, which I will go through. So maybe I already talked for 30 minutes, and maybe I'll just finish up and let other colleagues, with your permission, just to finish just 2 minutes on what we would say as the key achievements. You mentioned the inauguration of the Global Coalition Social Justice. We're the coordinator of the business side on that. So colleagues were also participating there. I would say it's a balanced text, and I let Menno and Gustaaf weigh in on that. And just to say, for the care economy one, I've never seen the EU, US, and other governments supporting our group before. That's the first time I've seen it since joining IOE. And that's very much thanks to all the lobby work. And Gustaaf was also critical in there in terms of lobbying the EU group. Typically it's Africa and Asia and the GCC with us, but this time we're seeing they don't agree with everything, but I've never seen the EU and US and other governments supporting us before. So we've seen the room move. So even if we're talking till 4 a.m. in the morning, it was worth it. It was a good outcome. And I also have to have a special shout out to Gustaaf for the closing remarks. So he did the closing remarks for Sonia Jinahi, our spokesperson. And you know, Gustaaf, Andrew, Bev, I mean, Sonia, you all made excellent contributions to that, the Care Economy Committee. And you know, you really helped us, you know, have a coherent approach. And I would say, Denis, I think we believe that the members are, I would say, mostly happy with the process, with the outcome. We heard it at the last, you know, at the closing remarks, where members took the floor. And what can we expect next year? I mentioned it's going to be tough, so we're going to need all your help. So if the WEC team could come in full force, that would be really welcome next year. We have the standard setting, as I mentioned, biological hazards, this platform economy one. I know Menno is on and Andrew is on the global task force on platform economy. We sent that lobby materials. And then we'll have the CAS, of course. And the new element here that I have not mentioned is that next year we'll have a general discussion on innovative approaches to tackling informality. That's something that we were pushing for, and we got it to promote transition towards formality, to promote decent work. So I stop here, Denis, and happy to answer, of course, questions from colleagues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tina, for this overview, and well done indeed from your side and from the ILO side to defend and represent the employer's voice. So from our side, we're so happy to be able to partner with you. So turning to the floor, any questions to Tina? Please raise your hand. But still, I have a question for you in the meantime, Tina, because getting back to the main achievement of, from the employer side. As you know, each employer's organization has a kind of its language we want to promote. As you know, from the World Employment Confederation's point of view, it has always been diverse forms of work, and we'll get back to that one later on. I know from the IOE, the concept of sustainable enterprise is a very important one that you are pushing and promoting. Could you tell us whether you have achieved any success there, managing to get some good language in some documents or promoting the concept?
For our care economy one, we have strong references to the role of the private sector. For sure, the workers were pushing back on that. They were allergic to the word public-private partnerships. We managed to get that in. So we have a standalone paragraph on that under guiding principles. We have enabling environment there. I'll let Gustaaf, there's a long list of like what we achieved on that. And I think, Menno, I looked at the fundamentals. There's a strong reference there to sustainable enterprises, enabling environment, innovation, generating employment on that. But, I would say for these committees, we do have some references on sustainable development, and that was a hard fight against the workers, so we managed to get some government support on that one.
No, and well done on that one, because from my side, I think this is a very smart and good concept, the sustainable enterprise that probably we need to maybe to better explain and elaborate further. But I think this is really a nice way to show that, we are responsible employers, we are willing to comply with regulation, we are in favor of enforcement of regulation and so on. So I think that's a very nice one. So any good language we can get on that concept would be really good for everyone, not only for the IOE, but for all employers. I don't see any hand being raised. Correct me if I'm wrong. Doesn't seem so. So, well, thanks again, Tina. Please stay with us. As mentioned, we are now going to look at the two main discussions that the World Employment Confederation has been following and thinking concretely on, starting with the fundamental rights and principles at work. As I mentioned earlier, this is Menno, who has been, representing the World Employment Confederation. Actually, staying 2 weeks in Geneva, and a big thank for that, Menno, for your active engagement there. So, Menno, I would be happy to hear from you indeed. What's your assessment on, what has been achieved there again, what have been the controversial points, what we managed to secure, maybe what we did not manage to gain? Yeah. Because I know that, we have the outcomes of the discussion, the proposed resolution and conclusion. So very easy to read those documents and to see what's in it, I think, but sometimes it's even more important to understand what is not in the documents, because this is something we managed to get rid of, or not to take, the trade unions of some governments, proposal into consideration. So happy to hear your view, Menno.
No, absolutely. And indeed, it was, maybe let me start by giving some context. So fundamental principles and rights at work were established in 1998. Initially, there were 4, then later on, they added a 5th one. And it's basically this set of principles. It's freedom from discrimination, freedom from child labor, freedom of forced labor, freedom of association and collective bargaining, and a healthy work environment. And these take a bit of a special place within the ILO because indeed, you already discussed, conventions are only legally binding when they are ratified. But these 5 fundamental principles and rights at work are considered so every member state can be addressed about implementing those principles and rights at work, even if they have not ratified. So this is really considered to be the basis for all workers around the world. They need to have access to those 5 rights. And since 1998, every so often, there is a recurring discussion, as it's called, taking stock of where we stand in terms of the implementation of those rights around the world. The last one was in 2017, and now we had another of those recurring discussions. And basically, the outcome of this discussion during the ILC would shape how the ILO office in the years going forward would go about its work to address those fundamental principles and rights at work, and how it would organize its work in order to promote the respect for these principles. And so that's basically what was at stake when we entered into this discussion. Now, in terms of priorities for us, I want to highlight three. Of course, there were endless small details that we looked at, but in the end, there were three main themes. And it was, I think, what was very good about the preparatory work that IOE did in this case was already before we landed in Geneva, we were all very clear about these are the main things that are important to us, and these are our red lines. And then, of course, we'll try to go as far as we can on every of the 500 points that are important to us. But in the end, if we have to choose, these 3 points are where we actually really want to score. Point number one, in describing the context of implementing fundamental principles and rights at work, there was a description of basically flexibilization, right? So the use of temporary work, agency work, and of course, what was implicit there was also the rise of platform work and how that would be linked to a deterioration of workers achieving their fundamental principles and rights at work. Now, on that point, I think actually we were quite happy because you already mentioned the terminology of diverse forms of work. That's been a battle that we've been waging for years, I think, at the ILO, right? There's always been this idea that there is standard work and there is non-standard, and non-standard is by definition bad, or typical and atypical, or normal and precarious. And I think this year it was the first time that I at least saw this in an ILO document where the ILO itself came up with the language of diverse forms of work in the report. And so they said diverse forms of work can have opportunities, but also brings along some challenges on how to realize fundamental principles and rights of work. And that was actually language that we were quite happy with. Now, of course, in the end, we had to tweak some of the language. There was a specific reference to agency work, which in the end, we weren't quite happy with. And so I think the outcome of that discussion, after a lot of back and forth, was one that is very satisfactory to us. And that really brought that balance of, yes, there are some challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunities that diverse forms of work bring. For example, to inclusion, and for example, to access to work, and thereby reducing discrimination. And all these kinds of elements were taken into account. The second battleground was on collective bargaining. Now, of course, I think all employers are very happy to embrace social dialogue as a right. And they all recognize that, yes, there is a right to collective bargaining. But what you see is that especially workers or trade unions, I mean, our spokesperson said it nice, when all you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail, right? So when collective bargaining is your strongest tool, every problem becomes a problem that can be solved by collective bargaining. Now, as employers, we, of course, have a very different perspective to this. Yes, collective bargaining can be a useful tool, but it's not the solution to all problems. And so we wanted to make sure that in these 5 fundamental principles and rights at work, there's equal attention to each of them. Whereas trade unions and some governments also see collective bargaining as an enabling right that will then lead to the actualization of the other 4 rights. And we wanted to make sure that we avoid such a hierarchy between rights and that it's all equal. I think there we were, again, quite successful. We managed to find some compromise language where there is one reference about collective bargaining and the power it has to enable other kinds of fundamental principles and rights at work, but there is no language that makes that even stronger, and there is no, we didn't really move on that issue. And then the third element, and you already mentioned it, was we were quite strong in our conviction that the best way to achieve fundamental principles and rights at work is by ensuring sustainable enterprises can actually offer jobs, offer decent work. And so what you need to do is make sure that there is an enabling environment for those bona fide, well-compliant companies. And this is, of course, a discussion that we recognize from the agency work discussion, right? So we also believe that agency work is decent work when you have the adequate and appropriate regulatory environment, and when you then also focus on enforcement of the rules so that you take out the malafide companies, the cowboys of the market. And here we had the same conversation. You need, on the one hand, an enabling environment, and on the other hand, capacity for labor inspections, etc. Now, in summary, I think we were quite lucky this year. So there is an element of, yes, of course, as employers, we did very well. I think we had an excellent spokesperson, an excellent team behind the scenes, and a strong delegation who were really good at lobbying the national government. We also were a little bit lucky, and sometimes that's also, the reality. I think we had a very balanced text to begin with from the office. Now, that could be luck. That could also be the result of negotiating for years about the office needing to take into account our interests. So that's one. I think, on the other hand, the worker side was a bit less well organized this time. They had a strong spokesperson, but they seemed to be going in different directions, and they were less ready to compromise. They weren't as smart negotiators as we've seen in the past. And we had some very reasonable government representatives. So indeed, also in our case, governments that are typically only worker friendly were now rather balanced, and actually also said, well, we need to be reasonable here. We support this point by the employers. And so in that sense, I think all in all, we managed to do quite well. Oh, you're still muted, Denis.
Thank you, Menno, for the overview and the main achievements. Without further ado, I will move to Gustaaf. So Gustaaf had time also to debrief on the decent work in the care economy, and then we can open up to questions. Also, maybe asking some other WEC members who have been there for the 2 weeks also to provide some additional comments. But Gustaaf, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Denis, and thank you, Menno, as well, for the overview for fundamental principles and rights at work. It's an honor to be here today. Maybe one disclaimer that I think is important to note is that during this year's International Labour Conference, the participation that I had this year was via the Dutch Central Employers Organization. So, I mean, it's more strengthening and a collaboration to do this with WEC, because we have the WEC observer status as well as the employer full weighted delegation, so to speak. So I think that combination worked very well. Including Bev's role, for example, from the South African employers delegation. So I think we were very well represented in our care economy discussion, if I may. Also, thanks to the help of Andrew during week 1 and Denis during week 2, as well as Sonia, who took over my role in week 2 via the Dutch Central Employer Organization. So we had a good, strong representation going this year. We had a phenomenal spokesperson, Sonia Jenahi. I have no idea how she stays so calm and collected throughout a discussion that goes on from early in the morning to, again, early in the morning, every single night. Again, I could not do that the same way she could. And I think that helped our discussion, because we were always informed and always ready. And every single time our spokesperson made a point, she took the time to make a point. And I think that also helped in the discussion to turn governments sometimes, because she could call governments out in a very nice, calm way by saying, hey, that's quite ironic, because on the one hand, you called us out as private enterprises, and here you're saying when it comes to funding that we need private enterprises to fund the care economy discussion. So I think that's a great factor, as well as the supporting role from Tina, from Stephanie, from Amadou. I mean, for some reason, sometimes the teams just click. I think we were well prepared, as Menno mentioned, with our red lines, as well as the points we wanted to make. So looking at the care economy discussion for us, we had 4 absolutely key essential points. 1 is on skills. 2 is on looking at gender and promoting gender equality. 3 is on productivity, so the value added by private care enterprises, services, and agencies. And number 4 was government investment. So that really looked at the investment in public infrastructures and social protection, not at the detriment of companies. So the discussion itself on the care economy took place in the general discussion forum. And with my limited ILO knowledge, I recognize that as kind of a precedent setting for a specific topic like the care economy. So the outcomes of a general discussion set the scene, so to speak, on 3 fundamental questions that are discussed throughout the International Labour Conference. Our 3 questions were on the critical aspects of what constitutes the care economy. So we managed to scope that to health and care, and a specific reference to education in childcare, for example. 2, what are the gaps and effective measures that ILO constituents have taken in the context of the care economy? And 3, given the ILO's mandate, what should ILO constituents and the ILO office do in terms of information gathering, data collection, funding, initiatives to promote decent work within the care economy? And those are the 3 questions that we covered over the course of 2 weeks. And I'm very lucky because I get to speak today, and Tina emailed or sent us a message about an hour ago with a list of outcomes, which I'm gonna summarize, if I may, in terms of what we got out of the discussion. It's quite a long list, but I think that also goes to show of some of the very important outcomes that we've managed to achieve as a committee. 1, we have a explicit recognition of the shortage of workers, not just in the opening speech, but as well as in the text. 2, we have an entire paragraph dedicated to the importance of upskilling, skilling, and reskilling of job seekers and employees within the care economy. We've managed to include referencing and terminology like the demand and supply in care within the context of the care economy, which was quite a long discussion and even a debate, if I may. We ended up including the demand for, supply of, and access to care in the opening text, which is a big win for us. We've managed to change the terminology of employment to employment opportunities, which is a big one for us. We've avoided listing, so which type of care workers or care providers, like domestic workers, for example. We didn't want entire lists of specific functions of care workers that needed extra attention and what have you. So we wanted to keep the discussion general, because that's, after all, what we were doing. We've managed to change poor working conditions to agreed and adopted ILC language. We've managed to exclude the slogan "care is not a commodity." It's quite a vague statement that was introduced in the text, and we've replaced it to "labor in the care economy is not a commodity." That's also within the spirit of the Philadelphia Declaration. There were some references to collective bargaining, but we've managed to include that as a part of social dialogue, as well as, to my personal surprise, employer initiatives as well, like workplace cooperation. I remember in the discussion last year, everyone was like, what is workplace cooperation? Tina calls it a dragon, if I'm not mistaken, that we've managed to include as listing. But the point being that there are also employer-led initiatives when it comes to the representation of employers within the care discussion. Productivity growth, an absolutely key one. I think we've mentioned this in the opening speech. It's in the text as well as in the closing remarks by Ms. Sonia Janahi. Without looking at productivity growth, there are no acknowledgements regarding the increasing costs within the care economy, public and private funding within the care economy, also to promote upskilling and the placement of workers in an increasing sector. So we have those references included as well. public-private partnerships. I think Tina mentioned this. This was probably one of the most contentious issues, I would say. I think trade unions flipped, as in they were angry. And I think governments, in the end, we managed to managed to have them endorse this concept as a standalone paragraph, because especially governments recognize that the care economy is not just a public-funded economy. In some countries in the UK, for example, it's different, but in many countries across the world, it's a public-private sector to take care of. And governments recognize this. So I think on such a key topic, we've managed to gain a majority to have a standalone paragraph on this in the text. And personally, I think that's one of the biggest wins that we managed to achieve. And the last one that I'm going to mention for the sake of time is also the importance of resources in this discussion. So throughout the general discussion, there are a lot of great ideas. There's lots of progress made through representation and promoting decent work in the care economy, avoiding informal forms of work. But how are we going to do this? Via resources. And we didn't manage to get it included in the theoretical concept that's key to this discussion. It's called the 5R framework. However, we have references to public-private partnerships, finance, funding, to make sure that without funding, we can't really change much. So in the recommendations to the ILO constituents and the ILO action, this is a concept that we can always refer back to for future discussions as well. So a long story short, very grateful. We have a lot of wins, and that's also because of the teamwork that we managed to do. So it's the content multiplied by, I think, the people that were there at the table for the discussions with a dream team there. That we managed to get so far. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Gustav, there again for the overview. And I would add indeed to the secret recipe of success, yeah, very good preparation ahead of the conference, of course, very important. I would turn to maybe Bev or Sonia or anybody else who was there, during the ILC. Do you want to come in and to provide some additional content or feedback? Bev, maybe?
Thank you, Denis. Obviously, to my partner there, I do recommend and endorse the whole issue of a dream team. But just to follow on from that, Gustav, in the closing remarks, the workers raised the issue of precarious work and predatory recruitment agencies. And it just shows that we are able to influence and participate in the discussion to stop that kind of language going into the text. And I think it's that collective element that is so important. And just one other takeaway from me, because I think so much has been said and it'd be good to hear from the others. But I was fascinated by how angry the workers were by us referring to skills. That came with the issue of people are not a commodity. And I think we need to be so careful. We talk about skills in South Africa. We need to talk about skilled workers, skilled workforce, etc. And just to fully understand, it's a red flag to them and to take note of small things like that actually make a difference. But my feelings, and I was so proud to be part of the team, Tina, to be working with you. It was absolutely great. And I think in future, we want to encourage the national teams as well to participate on a far better or a greater level. But really wonderful to be there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bev. Tina, you raised your hand.
No, I just wanted to come in and, just to say, yeah, I think they had a bad taste in their mouth because they felt like they lost everything that they wanted. Technical meeting of experts, precarious, abuse, exploitation, all the words that they wanted to include there was out. So they were, just to confidentially share with you, some of the I2 colleagues cried. They left because they received nasty messages from their own members because apparently they did so badly. They lost everything that they wanted. And I think that's why they felt kind of obliged to say something negative in the plenary, which is not very typical because once the text is adopted, because you look bad, you look like I would say sore loser in a way, because it's already adopted. It's a consensus, it's by consensus. So it doesn't look good on their side. And when I looked at, you know, the spokesperson of the workers group that sat next to Sonia, she was a little bit embarrassed, I have to say. She was a little bit embarrassed that she could not, I would say, satisfy her members. And that usually is an indication that I think we did really well, honestly. I mean, we felt bad for I2 colleagues, but we really felt we owned this text because everything that we wanted was there. So that just to give you a context back behind the scenes on why they felt the need to say something negative, because they couldn't, I would say, get what they wanted through their spokesperson. And I think strategy-wise, they accepted a deal which we shared with the group, which was not in their favor. Because we said, well, PPP has been accepted by a majority of our governments, except for you and GRULAC. So what can we exchange in that? And they gave us PPP and something else on top of that. They got rid of living wages. They got rid of progressive living wages, fair remuneration, working, the whole technical media, all gone. So I think they felt they were on the bad side of the deal. And just to say how proud we are of our group, I mean, Bev, your words, active labor market is there. That's your word. You know, innovation, that's yours. And Gustaaf, your word on skills recognition, skills certification, career progression, that's your word. So, you know, all these words are yours. It's in the text. Not only did we go through our own group, where we supported it through the amendments process, it was also supported in plenary by the governments, by the constituents. So this is really your achievement. We're just there to facilitate. And of course, it helps that we have an amazing spokesperson, Sonia, who is very calm. At least within the IOE team, we can take turns sitting at the front, but she was there from A to Z. She could not move. The rest of us, we could take turns and, you know, I could take a break, but she couldn't. So it really, colleagues, if you could send, you know, a whole team to your national delegations next year for the platform economy, we need your help. To the biological hazards, we need your help, because it seems like the governments are listening to you. So it really does change the direction of the room. So we need you there with us. We're counting on your support.
Point taken, Tina, and thank you very much for the kind words. I see two hands being raised, Menno and then Sonia. We still have 1 minute to go, so let's try to be succinct. But yes,
yeah, I'll be very brief. First of all, Tina, be careful what you wish for. You know, we'll no. Just an observation here, which is, I think when you think about negotiation strategies and you know, also when you think about this in a theoretical way, you always hear that try to find things that are mutually beneficial, right? For me, the big takeaway from now 2 ILCs is, unfortunately, that negotiations at ILC are often still, to some degree at least, a zero-sum game. If we get a positive reference, that's something that the unions will feel they lost. And vice versa, if we get a negative reference, the unions will feel that they've won. And so there's very much that idea of winning versus losing. And to some degree, that's actually, you know, almost the toxic part of negotiating at ILC. On the other hand, you know, that is also part of reality there. I think social dialogue per se, of course, we all believe in it. It's an ideological purpose that we all have, but we also don't need to be starry-eyed about it. It's eat or be eaten in a way.
Thank you, Menno. Sonia, I don't see your
Yeah,
hand being
but
raised. Here you are.
I see it's time, Denise. So I'll keep it really brief. I'm being part of the committee on the care economy. I'm extremely proud how we've held actually our fort during those days, and especially in that long day until, what was it, 4:15 a.m. in the morning. There was this moment in time. I think it was around 1:30, almost around 2 o'clock, where there was this paragraph on the screen where we thought, yeah, we can accept it, whatever, you know, let it go. And then all of a sudden somebody woke up and said, no, actually we can't. We have to be we have to be strong and to hold our fort here as well. And I think that's the momentum that I was extremely proud of the group, in the sense that we kept each other awake, we remained strong, we kept fearful, actually, in a way. And I think that's a big compliment to the group and to IOE as well, for keeping us awake, keeping us on our toes, but also keeping us sharp on the content. And I think the content discussion is what we have won with regards to all the other constituents. So yeah, extremely proud on what we have achieved with this group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And indeed, sorry, but there is one question in the chat, but I think we have now to close that meeting. And I would really restate what Tina said, the importance for next year. As you know, there will be this discussion on platform work, very important topic for the World Employment Confederation and our members. So indeed, we encourage all of our members to go through the national central employers organization to try to get a fit within their respective national delegation. As you said, Gustav, this is the best way, the most impactful way to have our key messages being conveyed. So we are waiting, for you even more in numbers next year for the ILC. But a big thank to all of you, Tina and the IOE, for supporting us and involving us into your work, and Gustav, Menno, Bev, Sonia, and of course the head office staff members, Andrew, Michael, Beatrice, who have been also very actively engaged in preparation and during the ILC. So big thanks to all of you. Thank you for attending this webinar. The next one will take place after the summer break. So we are going to break for the next 2 months, and we will reconvene in September for the economic session on our industry. So providing you with the latest data when it comes to the agency work industry and more broadly the HR services industry. But again, a big thanks to all of you. Enjoy the summer break if you are already off to your holidays. Well deserved for many of you. So yeah, enjoy that, and see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Denis.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Go well.